Hey there, I'm Jim. I'm a professional screenwriter, longtime teacher of the craft, but mainly I'm a storyteller, just like you, because we are all storytellers. That's why we like watching movies. That's what we do in this series is we look at little sequences from classic films and recent films and explore why the storytelling works, or maybe doesn't, in a particular part of a film. So today's movie is Sinners. I'm sure Ryan Coogler and company are going to be having a good time at the Oscars coming up. That's for sure. But the storytelling sequence that I'm looking at it's not a critique, again, but it is a question. And I think it has to do with genre. Of course, this is the horror genre. And Sinners reminds me of a film from a few years back called Midsummer, which was also a horror film, of course. And the similarity being that both have extended introductions before you realize they're horror films. and I was not caught off guard in Sinners because I was warned, but still, it's 43 minutes before he even enters that realm, right? Up until then, it's this beautiful period piece, like lots of, you know, African culture, music, stellar photography, stellar acting. I mean, the whole thing is very impressive. And about 43 minutes in, a vampire appears, which has nothing to do with Michael B. Jordan, the lead actor, or lead actors, because he plays twins. But it will. So this bloody white guy staggers up to the door of this random farmhouse and pounds on the door. And the owners, a husband and wife, open up the door and see him and say, please don't come in. And he begs them. He claims he's being chased by some like wild Indian group or something. And they're like, no, you can't come in. And he offers them this money that he has, this weird looking gold. And they actually let him in. And we cut to the vigilante Indian trio who have actually been chasing him, and for the proper reasons because they're human. And they arrive in like a car and a horse. It's kind of this funny mix, but they arrive outside the farmhouse because they've been tracking them, because they're Native American. They're good at that stuff, and they come up and they pound on the door, and now just the wife answers, and she still looks okay. And they're like, have you seen this desperate looking guy? And she's like, nope. And like, well, if he shows up, don't let him in. And if he's already in there, you better let us in to get him out. And she's like, nope, he's not here. Meanwhile, one of their colleagues is like, we gotta go, it's getting dark, and that's one of the rules of vampire worlds, I guess, vampires come out at night, so you gotta get home quick. So she goes, she closes the door and she goes back into her house and calls her husband. She's like, honey, and she goes back into the living room and looks down, and there's this, guy they let in munching on her husband's neck. It's classic. Looks up with blood splatter all over his face, and she's next, of course. So that's the introduction of the vampire sequence that's going to take over the entire film from pretty much now on in Sinners. And a bunch of other stuff happens, and then there's especially this wonderful, huge juke joint, huge black community blues party celebration thing, 1920s style. It's just really cool. Lots of music, and suddenly they have a guard, or a bouncer, so to speak. They're literally all by themselves at this huge old warehouse / juke joint on the middle of nowhere. But they still have a bouncer or guard at the door, and he sees these three white people coming towards their juke joint. And the leader, of course, is the vampire guy we saw earlier, who was bloody, who's no longer bloody. And now he's joined by his two new associates, the husband and wife farmer, who are also looking pretty good. And they all have instruments. Like, I think, vampire number one has a banjo and the other two have like mandolins. And they ask, hey, we heard there's like a big party here and we'd like to come in. And the guy's like, hold on a second. And then Smoke and Stack, which is the Michael B. Jordan characters, the twins, they show up next to the bouncer. And Smoke is like, no way, you can't come in. And they're like, oh, come on. He's like, are you guys the Klan? And the vampire number one says, no, we believe in equality, which of course is hilarious because, of course, race, religion, blood tastes the same. And then they step back and smile and lift up their instruments and break into this wonderful old like hillbilly bluesy song called I Picked Poor Robin Clean, It's like, I picked poor Robin clean. I picked his head, I picked his feet. I would have picked his body, but it wasn't fit to eat, something like that. And, they just go on and on. It's really kind of catchy. And it's kind of funny because Stack, of course, is over there going, ooh, hey, that's kind of catchy. And Smoke's like, hey, quiet. Smoke's the smarter of the two. Anyway, halfway through their song, Smoke stops him and says, hey, stop. And tells him, he's just like, now you guys go on back and go into town. There's plenty of white juke joints you can go to. You're not coming in here. And they plead to come in. And he says, nope. Sends them off. And they say, okay, but if you change your mind. And then they literally just go to like the perimeter, the perimeter of the darkness rather, and then stop out there. But regardless, everyone else goes back inside. But the point I'm trying to make here, I guess, is about rules. And rules are really important in storytelling, and especially, of course, in fantasy, things like science fiction. Not quite sure in horror when it gets out of hand how much rules really matter. But in this particular case, it's not really about what matters or not. It's about what we know. And I think sometimes people forget that not everybody knows the same things. And so, for instance, vampire culture or rules, right? Sure, horror aficionados are completely well-versed in all those, rules and regulations of what vampires can and cannot do, I'm sure. But I'm not, I know there's things like garlic and, if the sun comes up, stuff like that. But it all goes back to, vampires are definitely, Eastern European folklore stuff. It goes back forever. But regardless, doesn't mean we all know about it. So if you're going to make a movie where that's prevalent, it's nice, I think, if you can weave in the rules instead of doing it expositionally, like boring, like in your face, but if they can just subtly put it in there. Usually you have an expert of some sort who lets us know the rules. And again, not in our faces, but warns like, oh, remember, don't let them come inside the house, because if they come inside the house, they'll eat you, And actually, that's why I'm actually bringing this up, because that was the one rule I didn't realize. I don't know all the rules at all about vampires, but the one rule I didn't realize was this crossing the threshold. Like, they have to be invited in to a house. If they're not invited in, they'll leave, It's funny, it's like, okay, so vampires are like very well behaved. They have really good manners until you let them in. And then they bite you in the neck and kill you and turn you into one of them. But until then, they have very nice manners, which is a funny rule to make. But anyway, I didn't know that was a rule. But in this movie, it's huge because the vampires want to come in to the juke joint, but unless they're invited in, they can't come in. If they can come in, they can, go and bite everybody, right? And so that was why I really wanted to, ask that question. And not, again, it's not a critique of the movie at all, because I think it's incredibly well done, but I'm sure it's mystifying for some people who watch the film and like, why don't these vampires, they're like superhuman. Why don't they just fly upstairs and go through one of the windows up there? And the other one is, if you get bit by a vampire, you become a vampire. It's also, I guess, common knowledge, but it's actually funny. I think it's the same rules for zombies. and maybe werewolves. I don't know what the rule is with werewolves, or actually, what is it with mummies too? Now I think about it, but it's easier with aliens. Aliens just eat you, you know. So, not being well versed in vampires, of course, the first thing I did is like Google, and I'm going to read to you guys really quickly what came up because it pretty much explains everything from my point of view quite succinctly. And I didn't write it, but it's simple rules. Key traditional and pop culture rules for vampires. Weaknesses: sunlight, which is often lethal; wooden stakes, got that; garlic, knew that; crucifixes, actually knew that; holy water, running water, sure. Diet: must consume human blood to avoid starvation and maintain strength. That's understandable. Yeah, get that. Lifestyle: nocturnal, knew that; usually sleep in coffins during the day, also knew that. Good old Dracula. Abilities: hypnotic charm. Ooh, yeah, they are good at that. Unnatural strength. Speed and shapeshifting. Bats, mist, and wolves. So that's it. Yeah, there's probably more, but that's the basic gist of vampire roles. And the main one being, I didn't ever hear of this one about, being invited in. But it's a funny rule to have, and if it is a rule, I think it's probably would have been in the filmmakers in this wonderful little movie to have presented that. That's all. It's funny to think too, because logic really matters for me, again, as a storyteller when I'm watching a movie. And again, it doesn't matter how ridiculous, absurd, funny, comical, horrific it is, it still matters about logic, because if I don't believe it, and thus the audience doesn't believe it, it's a problem, right? And, vampire lore, okay, that's fine, but we still have to know, again, why they, for example, can't just like smash through the window and fly in and bite everybody. The other, sort of illogical thing that kind of irks me about this particular genre of horror is, the spreading by biting thing, It's different if you have one vampire like Dracula, so the good folks out there, the farmers or whatever, they gotta get Dracula. If they get rid of Dracula, they're safe. But if it's vampires, that means there's multiple, or at least one, and if you bite someone else, there's more, right? But the multiplication is exponential if they start biting. Yeah, you know what I mean? It's like COVID, There's like one case in Northern California or something. Next thing you know is planet-wide. Let's just call it the fox and geese analogy. Let me just explain. When I was a kid, I was in Boy Scouts, and I think the average age was like 12, but it was, 10 to 14 years old. So I think there was like 60 of us in our particular troop back in Lincoln, Massachusetts. And every Wednesday night or whatever it was. But often we would play this game called Fox and Geese. I can't believe they let us play it. They never would today. It's too dangerous. But basically what it meant was that all 60 of us would be put against the wall in this gymnasium where we had our troop meetings. And then one kid was the fox, and he stood in the middle of the basketball court, basically at half court. And then the troop leader would blow a whistle, and all 60 of us would charge toward this one poor kid, And he was a fox, and we were the chickens. So he had to tackle whoever he could, and he of course could only tackle one, and he would. So he'd tackle one person. So then two people were in the middle, and we'd all run to the other wall, and we're the chickens, right? And then they'd blow the whistle, and we'd run back, and so those two people would tackle two more people, So dook, dook, dook. And suddenly, it flip-flopped, and so you had like 60 people or 50 people in the middle, and like 8 or 10 people against the wall who are going to get crushed, But same mentality. It's sort of like COVID, right? It's like once you get bit, the whole planet's done, right? Like I think it was in Northern California, there was one case at one point. And within about 6 months, the entire world was definitely covered with COVID. But with vampires, it's the same thing. Especially if they're so superhuman, logic-wise, it's like, come on, once they bite 3 humans, it's all over, right? What are we going to do? We can't hide inside all day long if we even know the rules, but they're going to get us. So, anyway, not complaining. I'm just saying the rules are a little bit funky in horror sometimes. And I thought that's sort of a funny one. It's all in good fun, right? So if you enjoyed this, give me the hitchhiker sign, and definitely drop anything in the comments, especially if I've been remiss or wrong about all the rules of vampire stuff. And otherwise, any films that you might want me to look at, I'll definitely check out. So until next time, right on.